A Doll Called Peggaty, written and read by Christopher Halton. Amos Winryder lived with his wife Alice in their neat 3-bedroom terraced house in Acton, London. They had lived there for many years, and despite every effort to start a family, they had been very unlucky indeed. Countless visits for fertility treatment in the early years of the century had convinced doctors that Alice was infertile. Consequently, they resigned themselves to living quietly alone, doting upon their pet terrier Carnegie, whom they had adopted as a stray from the street. By 1920, both now in their early 60s, they were convinced that they would one day pass over with no heir or loved one to keep and live in their cherished little brick mortar and slate-tiled house, and all their memories would be scattered into the hands of scurrilous dealers at the behest of a solicitor engaged to dissolve their estate, such as it was. That was until shortly after Carnegie had died of old age, when their neighbour Marion Johnston appeared at their door with her 10-year-old daughter Florence in tow. Marion, a slim, attractive woman in her early 30s, had lived with Florence, or Flossie as she was called, in a similar but rented terraced house opposite them since the child was born. Marion, a typically jocular character of a kindly disposition, appeared fraught with worry, and asked to speak to Amos and Alice in private. The couple had no qualms about Marion or her daughter, and invited both into the house to speak. Flossie went to play with her doll in the garden on that hot July day, while Marion was invited to sit in the lounge with Amos, and Alice brought in a pot of tea with some freshly baked scones. Having all sat down together and having expressed the usual pleasantries of the day, Amos said to Marion in a kindly voice, "How can we help you, Marion?" He added, "If you don't mind me saying, you appear very upset by something that's troubling you." Marion sat at first very quiet and reserved, and holding the saucer in her hand, she sipped from her cup, and said with an air of trepidation, "I don't know how to say this, but Alfred, my husband, has abandoned us, and has moved away from the house with some other woman." She paused, put down her cup and saucer on the tray on the table, then wiped the gathering tears from the corners of her eyes, while Amos offered her a handkerchief which she used to dry the moisture on her cheeks before continuing. "Well, I can no longer afford to live in our home, as I need a job to support Flossie, and in that regard I need to travel to a family friend in Lancashire who has offered me a 6-month service role at a country estate near Preston, with an income that will allow me to return and rebuild my life. But Flossie cannot come with me. I'll be staying in the servants' quarters, and children aren't allowed. So I must ask from the bottom of my heart, would you look after her until my return? I shall be no longer than is necessary. I can give you all of her clothes and toys if you can. From the kindness of your heart, spare a bedroom for her." Alice sat quietly in shock and anticipation at the sound of children's laughter in their home, and readily replied excitedly, of course we can. Yes, we have a spare bedroom that will be perfect for her. Please don't worry about paying for food or board. We are more than willing to take her in." Amos, more than aware of his wife's enthusiasm, interjected, "But how will Flossie take it, Marion? She has lost her father, and now she's losing you." She responded, "Flossie is quite grown up for her age, and she has lived in a house where a drunken brute, her father, resided. She will see this as heaven. She knows you both very well, and if you recall, she sometimes played with Carnegie, bless him." Amos sat quietly, pondering for a moment, and stroked his handlebar moustache, briefly rubbing his chin in deep contemplation. He muttered under his breath. He then straightened himself and said to both women, "Okay, let's go with that. But first we must ask Flossie ourselves what she actually wants." With that, Marion left the room and returned shortly afterwards with little Flossie, an adorable blonde-haired child in pigtails, who wore a one-piece checked dress, white socks and sandals. She was holding a wooden doll called Peggaty, who was dressed similarly. It was to the relief of all that Flossie was happy to stay, and despite the obvious sadness of not seeing her mother for a while, she was very excited when shown her room and around the house. It was evident that Flossie's home wasn't as well furnished or maintained as the Winryders', and this was mainly due to her father's alcoholism. He sold anything of value to support his selfish lifestyle. What was left was either old, worn out, or broken because of his heavy rages. The fact that he went with another woman must have been like a breath of air in poor Marion and Flossie's lives. But that was now all in the past, and the Winryders had to rebuild Flossie's life to make it as comfortable as possible during her mother's absence. Having helped move Flossie into her new temporary home, Marion and her daughter were left alone together to hug and talk before her impending journey to Lancashire later that evening. An hour later, Marion departed by cab and would not be seen for many months, although she promised to write regularly and to send whatever spare cash she had for Flossie's benefit. The first few weeks of Flossie's new life with the Winryders were not without their problems, as Flossie was readjusting to a new, more pleasant life, but sadly without her mother's guidance. Marion did write regularly and sent cash by postal order, which the Winryders used to buy new clothes and toys for little Flossie, although her crudely made doll Peggaty was inseparable from her. In the months that followed, all were progressing well, and Flossie addressed Amos and Alice as her uncle and aunt. But despite the apparent joy and happiness, a dark and ominous cloud lay ahead on the horizon in the form of her father, who had returned to reclaim his daughter. He arrived on their doorstep one late September evening, quite drunk and very belligerent, demanding to see his daughter. The Winryders tried their best to reason with him, and in the commotion caused by the swaggering brute screaming and shouting, Flossie appeared in the tiled hallway in her nightdress, holding her doll. Very calmly she said to her father, "I no longer wish to live with you, Papa. This is my home, and Peggaty wants rid of you." With that, her father, Alfred Davies, stopped silent for a moment, laughed hysterically at his daughter's suggestion, and said, "I'll be back in the morning, young lady. You will come with me to stay at your new home with your new mother." He turned, unable to balance himself, and using the front door frame, propelled himself onto the street, where he was last seen staggering down the pavement, guided by the gaslights fringing the road. The Winryders were shocked. They had never expected Davies to turn up on their doorstep, and even less to reclaim control of poor Flossie. But Flossie was quite unperturbed. She smiled as she turned upstairs to return to her room, and said in parting, "Please don't worry, Auntie and Uncle. Peggaty knows we won't be seeing him again." With that, she went to her room and closed the door. The Winryders chuckled among themselves, and Alice said, "Oh, I do wish that to be so, bless her." They thought no more about it and went to bed. The following day the morning newspaper arrived through the letterbox, and Amos sat down at the breakfast table, glancing through it while Alice prepared breakfast. 2 pages in was a reported death of a man who was allegedly pushed in front of a bus 2 streets from where they lived. A cold chill ran down Amos's spine when the deceased's name was given as Alfred Davies. Without saying a word, he took the paper to Alice as she was cooking on the stove and pointed to the entry. She stopped, read it, and both turned to each other in silent shock. "Surely it cannot be," said Alice. "Undoubtedly it is," said Amos. "It says the deceased was drunk and tripped on the curb into the path of a red double-decker. It has to be him." "My God," said Alice. "Can you check with the police before I break the news to Flossie?" "No need to tell me," said Flossie, who had arrived behind them in the kitchen. "Peggaty told me last night." Both looked behind, and there stood Flossie with her old wooden doll. She had a pleased told-you-so smile. Amos, feeling very uncomfortable, said to Flossie, "Now, my dear, I know your daddy wasn't a very pleasant chap, but even so, if it was him, he was, after all said and done, your father." Flossie then held up the doll and said, "Peggaty told me he was a bad man, and she went out last night and pushed him in front of the bus. Peggaty said that all evil men must be punished for their bad deeds, because Peggaty was once hurt by bad men a long time ago, and Peggaty does not like bad people." Despite all that Flossie said, both Amos and Alice felt that she must have overheard them talk about it, or perhaps had even read the report in the newspaper before Amos removed it from the letterbox. Of course, both explanations were nonsense, and they knew it. But how did the child know? Amos decided from that moment to learn more about the doll and wrote a letter to Marion, explaining the sudden demise of her husband and asking whether she could throw any light on where Flossie had acquired the doll. A week later, a reply was received in the post from Marion. She was shocked to read of Alfred's demise, and in answer to the question about the doll, explained that it had been given to Flossie 2 years earlier by an old gypsy lady who lived in a caravan on the fringes of Barnet Gate, a rural area on the edge of the city, around an hour away from Acton. She had travelled there with a friend for a day's outing with Flossie, and their car had broken down by a small gypsy cluster of horse-drawn Vardo caravans. It was there that one of the gypsy men had fixed the car while Marion, Flossie and their friend were invited to sit inside this old lady's Vardo nearby, where they drank tea. Her name was Old Nan, and she was a mystic. She gave Flossie the doll as a gift. Amos decided to take a drive in his Morris Cowley over to Barnet Gate in the hope of finding this gypsy woman. After a relatively uneventful journey, he arrived in the area and quickly discovered a gypsy encampment lying on the edge of some fields. Sure enough, as described in Marion's letter, he found the caravan, which was brightly coloured red and beautifully painted with gold designs. The Vardo sat on the back of a wagon, with worn wooden steps leading up to an open-ended door from which an elderly woman smoked a clay pipe while sitting on a stool. She saw Amos approach and smiled. "You've come about Peggaty, haven't you?" she said. Taken aback, Amos replied, "Yes, how on earth did you know that?" She replied, "I know many things, some good and some bad. You'd better come inside." With that, she got to her feet. She wore an old-fashioned long-flared dress made from coloured strips of different cloth. She wore a number of charms on her arms and neck, and had a dark brown complexion, her skin looking like worn old leather. She was slightly overweight and in her early 80s, although very sprightly for her age. Her long grey hair was tied into a headscarf, and while holding the clay pipe, she beckoned Amos to sit on a narrow bench inside. Once seated, she stared intently at Amos for a minute or two. Her eyes scanned every facet of his face, as though looking for some intangible clue. She then said, "You are a good man, and you live with your wife, looking after the little girl, Flossie. What you seek is where I got the old doll I gave her." She grinned with a knowing smile and added, "Let me explain. I knew about her father and gave her Peggaty to protect her from harm. If I had not, she would have died with her father in an accident if he had returned to collect her in the morning. Peggaty stopped that." She then puffed a little on her pipe and said, "Do you believe in witchcraft?" Amos replied, somewhat confused as to where this conversation was going. "I believe others in the past believed in witchcraft, and I know many innocent women and some men were falsely accused and put to death." She raised her eyebrows. "Well, we witches exist. I am a witch, or whatever label society would affix to me. I am a good witch, but others are bad. Peggaty was a witch, burned at the stake in the 17th century. The doll was carved from wood that escaped the flames, and within it her soul still lingers. I swore she would protect the child." Amos angrily interjected, "But to kill that brute was evil, do you not think? Peggaty was a good woman in life. She used her powers to help. But she was murdered by Matthew Hopkins, the so-called witch-finder general, and he was evil." She paused to regain composure as she was becoming quite agitated and continued, "You can only fight fire with fire, and if anyone harms Flossie or becomes a problem, then Peggaty will act." Amos was annoyed by Old Nan's logic in justifying crimes in pursuit of self-perceived justice and said, "I could have dealt with that drunk myself without magical charms. I want to return the doll to you, as Flossie is now safe with Alice, my wife, and me, and we are starting to love her as a daughter. The longer she keeps this doll, the greater the risk that Flossie will be corrupted by it." Old Nan smiled cynically. But she has to give up the doll willingly to get rid of it. Nothing else will do." Although both agreed to disagree, there was no animosity, and shortly afterwards Amos returned home, where he shared his encounter with old Nan. Alice, too, was very perturbed, and they both agreed that Flossie's attitude had changed somewhat since the death of her father. She was becoming more self-assured in a way that made the Winryders feel very uncomfortable. As the weeks progressed into winter's cold, Flossie became more dominant and demanding than ever before. In fact, the Winryders were becoming fearful of her, careful with their words when speaking to her. One night they were awakened from their sleep by the barking of a small dog in their bedroom. The barking sounded screechy and weak, but as they turned on their bedside light, there stood on the carpet the half-rotted remains of their dog, Carnegie, who had been buried many months ago in their back garden. Half of his face was missing, exposing his canine jaws. Patches of fur lay scattered on the carpet, and his eyes were exposed from their sockets, worms wriggling from the bare patches of his body. The stench was appallingly bad, and yet here was a very rotted but apparently animated corpse of their beloved pet brought back from the grave, as they suspected, by Peggaty for nefarious reasons, because Amos questioned old Nan. Standing in the dimly lit corner of the bedroom was a grey shade in the form of a woman, and from there came the most devilish laugh they had ever heard. As the figure and laughter faded away, the corpse of Carnegie also disappeared, and the vile stench dissipated from the room. Amos immediately leapt from his bed and very quietly entered Flossie's bedroom. All he saw was Flossie lying fast asleep, cuddling the wooden doll which, although crudely made, now bore a cut mark on its face similar to a human smile. Enough was enough. Amos was compelled, now and forever, to deal with this monster of evil that possessed this poor child. Quietly taking the doll from the arms of the deeply asleep child, he dressed quickly and wrapped the doll in a cloth, which he then placed securely in the trunk of his car. Alice agreed to remain with the child while he drove for an hour back to old Nan's caravan. During the journey he could hear what sounded like a fully grown woman screeching and snarling, trying to kick open the trunk door. This hellish screaming lasted for the duration of the journey, and he was thankful it was in the middle of the night, as nobody could hear this dreadful crying, which surely would have attracted the police. Eventually he arrived at the encampment, and the screaming and kicking ceased. Cautiously he went to the trunk, expecting to find a fully formed woman, but instead found the wooden doll as he had left it. Fortunately there was a metal brazier still containing hot ash, and he threw the doll onto it. It quickly burst into flame, with the cackling sound of a woman screaming coming from the fire. As the doll burst into flame, he saw the door flung open on old Nan's caravan. She too was aflame and ran out across to the brazier to save herself and the doll, but it was too late. She collapsed into a heap as the fire quickly consumed her entire body, which went out as her body turned to ash. The most inexplicable thing was that nobody in the encampment was disturbed, and the brazier quickly returned to dull, hot ash. Old Nan's ashes were blown away in a short, sharp gust of wind that disappeared back into stillness. It was as though some other force had decided to protect Amos from harm, and he was then able to return home without incident. The following morning at breakfast, Flossie sat down at the table and happily ate her food without mentioning Peggaty. As for old Nan, she was never heard of again, despite being reported missing to the police. Within a few months, Marion returned to collect Flossie, as she had been promoted to a senior estate position that included a home, and the doll was never mentioned again. Although childless once more, sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Alice swore she could hear a child's laughter flicker in the embers of the fire, which gave a sense of comfort to them both. The Winryders, however, kept in regular contact with Marion and Flossie, and were honoured to be invited to Lancashire 10 years later to rejoice in Flossie's marriage to a young estate employee, with whom they eventually raised their own family. The end. The Charnel House, written and read by Christopher Halton. As a child, I was raised in a remote Cumberland stone house, reminiscent of a Peggaty-type structure called Pomeroy Hall. The property, so my family loved to remind me, was built by a distant ancestor named Sir Gilbert de Pomeroy as a fortified house in the 13th century, which protected a section of the border from marauding Scottish raiding parties who, without landowners like de Pomeroy, would pillage the English border of property and livestock. Of course, that all ended in the 17th century, and over the years the property was extended with wings all built with the same dark brown Cumberland stone, featuring thick walls designed to resist attack, although not as substantial as those found in a castle. For their part, the Scots were fearsome and reckless warriors who attacked, raped and pillaged without mercy, and as the de Pomeroys were wool merchants, sheep theft and the killing of the odd shepherd were a relatively common occurrence. Subsequently, I was told, any Scots taken as prisoners by the de Pomeroys were hanged, drawn and quartered, with their butchered remains displayed on posts near the border as a warning to those who crossed into England. Such was the hatred and contempt for human life during these turbulent centuries that the rule of civilized law was at times ignored to suit the agenda of the Scottish raiders and my ancestors. Of course, such tales had their consequences, with reported hauntings of shadow men in the courtyard, and the sound of screaming and pleading had been reported, due in part to the execution of prisoners taken from the frequent forays across the border. Gilbert was a fearsome warrior, and it was said that he had participated in the Crusades, where he had led the forces of Christendom in historic battles against the forces of Islam. And so the reputation of my family was such that even to the present day, travellers from across the border were loath to enter its domain, despite being at peace for 300 years. One might wonder that living in such a place during my childhood, with my parents and grandparents, would have exposed me to all sorts of ghouls haunting its walls, and yet, for me, it did not. I had a pleasant childhood with my own Nanny Simpkins and the family cook, Mrs. Ingram. The two maids, Jessie and Margaret, made my life as comfortable as possible in this cold, windswept location, and I wanted for naught. I moved away at the age of 10 to London, as my father, Sir David Pomeroy, was working as a banker for an old English banking family. Before our move, he used to commute to London by train and return each month for a few days' break. Mother would miss him terribly, and so my new life from country to city life became the norm until, many years after the Great War, I decided to return to the house to take up the reins of responsibility, as by then my father had died, and Mother no longer wanted the responsibility of administering the estate through a manager employed at the Hall. And so, at the age of 30, I, Sir David Pomeroy, returned to the Hall in May 1930 to take up residence on an estate that grazed over 1,000 sheep. The animals roamed the hillsides surrounding the Hall, while the lowland areas were dotted with clumps of forest, which was home to deer, and featured a rocky stream that meandered through the picturesque Cumberland landscape. By then I was married to Millie, a lady who had spent her entire life in London and, as such, had never left the city or its environs, and for her and our two children, Roger, aged 8, and Sylvia, aged 5, this was a whole new life which surprisingly perhaps they took to, like fish to water. The Hall, although well maintained, was rather dated, and with 8 bedrooms, a dining hall, reception room, lounge and sitting room, it required considerable work and expense to modernise. The kitchen was old world but well equipped, and even had its own bread oven and dairy room, where everything needed for self-sufficiency was catered for. We decided to lightly modernise this area with new lighting and an oven. The kitchen cupboards were old but made of mellowed oak, which had faded to a beautiful golden hue over the years. The oak beam ceiling had many hooks holding immaculate handcrafted brass kitchenware that was many years old, and the ambience of the kitchen was warm and wholesome. Other parts felt less so, but we reasoned some improvements and a lick of new paint would cure that. Having employed an architect to draft a new visualization for the place, we engaged a manager from nearby Carlisle, who in turn engaged a team of craftsmen, while we took temporary residence in a rather delightful 18th century townhouse in that city. The work on the house, as it transpired, was onerous, involving the installation of new mains water, drainage and electricity. By November, most of the work was completed. However, what was believed to be a stone wall sealing a tunnel was later discovered in the cellar when a builder accidentally dislodged a stone block into a dark chasm beyond. Following this discovery, I was contacted by telephone by my project manager John Millfield, who, in a seemingly nervous tone, requested that I attend the hall at the earliest opportunity. Having driven over in our Mercedes family saloon car, I was greeted at the entrance by Millfield, who, with a roll of papers that I presumed to be my architect's drawings, escorted me into the hall area. Apart from him, I saw no other workmen present on site and asked why this was so. He looked at me with a trembling voice and said, "The men have walked off site since the breach in the cellar wall was made." He nervously paused and said, "They claim dark grey shadows of men haunt the place." I laughed and said, "This is preposterous. I lived here as a child and there was nothing untoward that would suggest this." He replied, "You'd better follow me, Sir David, and you'll soon see why." With his head bowed, I followed this middle-aged, heavily built man wearing a brown raincoat and sporting a mop of brown, unruly hair, into the hall and down some stone steps into the cellar, where he rather quickly turned on a light switch which illuminated the arched walls and ceiling from where I could see, some 20 feet away, a hole in a wall with broken stone lying asunder and intermingled with workers' tools, which looked as though they had been swiftly abandoned. "Good God!" I said in utter amazement. "What the hell has gone on here?" "Well, sir," he then ushered me with his hand to follow him to the debris and tools, whereupon he removed from the sagging left pocket of his coat an electric torch, which he shone into a broken, jagged void that breached into the wall. I stood alongside him as he passed me the torch, and saw through the blackness of the hole what appeared to be an ossuary with stone shelves, which neatly supported many human remains. I could see at least 20 skulls on one shelf, neatly stacked together and on top of each other, and below that, on another shelf, other bones lay neatly in an almost herringbone pattern across two lower shelves. The smell which permeated from there was ancient and appalling, and I could perfectly understand why any sane human being would run when confronted with this. But for shadows, the sight must have triggered appalling hallucinations, which in the circumstances were perfectly understandable. I ordered Millfield to help me remove the remaining stone from this enclave wall, and after an hour the work revealed a perfect entrance, upon which we entered, both of us rather in trepidation as to what we might discover within. Apart from our initial discovery, there were many other shelves in the room, 20 feet by 20 feet square, and we estimated at least 100 bodies of human remains lay within. All were neatly stacked in a way that suggested whoever did this took some great pleasure in the act of doing so. Among these were the bones of some women and children too, and I felt physically shocked and sickened to the point that I wanted to vomit. Here were the remains of a charnel house of some great antiquity, as also stacked neatly upon each other were rusted claymore swords and crude-looking shields. Additionally, some fragments of rotted tartan cloth lay on the ground, giving the impression that these had once been kilt cloth laid out like a carpet. I had my suspicions about who might be responsible, and Sir Gilbert's name came to mind immediately. I was hurt that my family name and family reputation were besmirched, and like Millfield, I was almost drawn to tears. I put my arm around his shoulder and led him back to the outside of the hall, where we both stood stunned for some minutes, sharing a cigarette each. Looking into his watery eyes, I said, "We must report this immediately to the authorities. These bones look centuries old, but we have to report this in order that these remains receive a decent Christian burial." He nodded quickly in agreement as he puffed heavily on his cigarette, and I immediately contacted the police by telephone, who shortly attended and, like us, were also visibly horrified. With the assistance of the police, the county coroner, Dr. J.B. Arrowsmith, attended, and over a period of 3 days, the total remains of 80 men, 7 children, and 25 women were removed by vans. Despite these being historic remains, a coroner's court was convened a month later, and all were discovered to have been the victims of being stabbed in the chest. All their heads were removed with an axe. By the remnants of items discovered and the method of execution, they were believed to be medieval ritual killings. As there were no living suspects, the case was closed, and the unnamed remains were buried in a specially prepared mass grave at the local church of St. John's in the village of Pomeroy, with a fitting service performed by both vicars of the Church of Scotland and the Church of England. As noble and honourable as I intended to rectify a wrong committed, I believe, by my ancestor, Sir Gilbert, my family naturally refused to live in the house, partly because of the discovery, and also because local gossip had declared the place haunted. I therefore came to an agreement with my family that if I proved the property to be cleansed of any alleged hauntings, had the hall blessed by a priest, and there were no further alleged occurrences, they would move in. And so, here are the results of that compact made with my family, which I will to this day never forget. My first act was to have the hall blessed and spiritually cleansed by Father McKinnon, a priest from a Catholic parish in Carlisle. He had, I was told, a history of performing exorcisms. In his early years he came from a tough Glaswegian estate in Scotland, and by nature was a hard and stoic man. During the interim I stopped all building work, which by now was largely cosmetic, and I moved back into the hall for a month to complete these tasks, as I feared losing my family over this historic tragedy. Father McKinnon was more than happy to help, partly because of the dilemma I was facing, and also as a moral act of duty for the many Scottish victims of Sir Gilbert. On a cold February afternoon in 1931, Father McKinnon arrived at the hall and intended, at my invitation, to stay for as long as was necessary to ensure that lost souls and evil had been cleared from the building. Arriving in a small Ford Prefect saloon with his assistant, a junior priest named Father Horace, I met them at the hall entrance and took them inside. Father McKinnon was a tall, well-built man of around 40 years who sported red hair and beard. Despite his rather tough demeanour, there was gentleness in his eyes which twinkled a warmth that I found reassuring. His assistant, Father Horace, was in his late 20s, slightly built and shorter than McKinnon. He was an Englishman who originated from Cheshire and was softly spoken with a clean-shaven face and brown, neatly trimmed hair. They appeared to work in unspoken harmony, the assistant now well accustomed to the grim rhythm of exorcisms and house purifications. Their bags held little more than essentials, and the sacred cloth they would soon lay out for the rite and some personal belongings. After settling into their rooms, we met later in the lounge in front of a roaring log fire, where I discussed the history of my family and the horrific discoveries in the cellar. Father McKinnon sat quietly cradling a glass of scotch, and after listening to me said, "Do you mind if we look into the cellar? I'll be honest with you, Sir David, I am sensitive in a spiritual manner, and I don't like what I am feeling at this moment." We then went down to where the room was discovered, and as he entered he staggered, apparently struggling to catch his breath, and gasped, "I know all there is to know. Please let us leave now." With assistance from both Father Horace and me, we helped him return to the safety of the lounge, where he quickly recovered from the experience. He sat quietly in deep contemplation, studying the flickering of the flames, and said, "Your ancestors, sir, enjoyed slaughtering innocents as well as warriors in battle. I make no apology for what perhaps my ancestors did in the past, but Sir Gilbert was a heathen, and sacrificed these poor souls, whose remains were found in that room, as an appeasement for Satan, whom he worshipped as an apostle for a secret brotherhood of knights that were founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades. This I know because he told me so while we went into that room of damnation and hell." He took a shot of whiskey from a glass and continued, "I have a gift that I regard as being from God, in the sense that I am what others describe today within certain circles as a medium. A few years ago I was like every other man until one day I performed the last rites to an elderly woman who practiced white witchcraft. She had what I discovered was a third eye, which allowed her to see and experience things that exist beyond this realm of reality. As she gasped her last breath, she held my hand and said, "You are blessed, use it wisely." She then died. I had no notion of whatever she was talking about until the following day, when I became aware of the existence of things beyond rational human understanding. In my church, I would have been executed as a witch in times past, and only Father Horace knows of my gifts, which he too agrees are a divination from God, and nothing to be ashamed of. However, the mainstream church is not aware of this except for my successes in dealing with exorcisms, which today are regarded by some as complete nonsense. Therefore, I must share this with you, provided you promise as a gentleman that I have your word of honour. I was mesmerized by his words and said very affirmatively that my lips were sealed. He smiled, fell back into the seat of the sofa he was sitting upon, and asked for another scotch, which I willingly supplied. "Tomorrow," he continued, "we will learn more and deal with this. But I can tell you that when that war was removed, not only were the souls of innocents released, but also those of the evil ones who had been tormenting them for centuries, and now they are loose in this house and must be sent back to the fiery depths of hell from whence they came." A terrified chill went down my spine, and Father Horace too looked shocked at his colleague's revelations. For a while longer, as he sat and mused on his tasks ahead, he explained that when he entered the room, he saw Sir Gilbert surrounded by ugly demonic entities who attempted to strangle him. Sir Gilbert hated the Scots with a passion, and he admitted that his tasks would be made more difficult because of that. He warned me to be wary during the night and suggested that we all sleep together in the lounge within a protected circle, blessed with holy water and an incantation ritual of protection, because Sir Gilbert would use force to attack and dislodge us. Having agreed to all of that, I simply could not believe that any of this was real in the modern era of the 20th century. But, on the other hand, I felt I could trust Father McKinnon, who was quite a rational man, and I had a deep faith and trust in his beliefs, which I admit I had never experienced for myself. That night, Father Horace and I slept on bunk beds, while Father McKinnon slept on the three-seater sofa. Before retiring to sleep, he drew a solid circle in chalk on the bare stone floor, with a protective Latin spell written within the circle's perimeter and a crucifix drawn in the centre. For half an hour, both he and Father Horace read a protective spell from an ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was followed by a Christian prayer in Latin before sprinkling holy water over the three of us, at the end of which he said, "There, it is done. We must remain in the circle until dawn. Anything you see or hear is not real, and despite your better judgment, you must ignore it." To be perfectly honest, I did not feel like I wanted to sleep, and yet oddly I did, because I was awoken at 3 a.m. by a strong gust of wind which blew into the circle. At the command of Father McKinnon, we stood in the centre of the circle where we linked arms while facing each other. "Stand your ground and hold on tight," he shouted. "This is the first wave." Around the circle I saw what could best be described as a typhoon of energy made of many human forms and some devilish ones, which spun faster and faster in a grey smoky mass. The stench from this manifestation had me almost gasping for breath, but the good father held true to his faith, and it stopped. "Do not let go," he pleaded. "There will be more." And then the second wave appeared in the forms of children, begging for Sir Gilbert to let them go as he bloodily struck them with a broadsword, causing voluminous amounts of blood to spurt into the circle and upon our clothes. The children were pleading for help and stared at us, crying as he cut them to pieces while laughing maniacally as he did so. I wanted to help, whether real or not. I wanted to go to them, to stop this. Father McKinnon shouted again, "This is not real. This is the work of Satan, and you must ignore it. Look at me, look at me." And so we did, and it stopped. and the room was quiet again. Strangely, despite the typhoon and the later slaughter of the innocents, nothing outside the circle was disturbed or displaced. Still, a pervading sense of evil was palpable, a kind of heavy aroma of bad sweat and filth which would not go away. Father McKinnon and Father Horace looked visibly relieved after having to witness the display of evil that had manifested earlier. But with a cautionary word of warning, he said the worst was yet to come and that we must be prepared for it. I said, "Do you know, Father, what that might be?" He replied rather glumly, "I don't, but it will be a powerful illusion which will test the thin line between the supernatural and the real. And despite whatever happens, we must link up as before and ignore it, for however real it may seem, it is a deception to step outside the circle of light." Sure enough, around an hour before dawn, the now burnt-out fireplace suddenly burst back into flame, and like a flamethrower, it propelled long spurts of fire into the room. Very quickly, the furniture and room around the circle burst into flame, and the air was thick with an acrid smoke that we were starting to inhale as the fire appeared to take hold, and the temperature was such that we could feel our skin and clothing beginning to burn. Suddenly, Father Horace shouted, "Can't you see? The house really is on fire. It is burning me. Can't you feel it?" Father McKinnon remained firm. "Just keep linked to each other as before and we will be safe. As real as this feels, you are not harmed unless you step outside the circle." If the heat and the burning grew stronger with intensity, and Father McKinnon recited a prayer of protection over and over, which helped reduce the effects of what felt real as we saw the beams catch fire and the walls starting to collapse. I held firm, but Father Horace suddenly lost self-control and broke from the arm-length circle and screamed, "We're all going to die if we remain. I am leaving." We struggled to hold him, but we could barely breathe, and the intensity of the heat was making us feel that we were burning too. And so Father Horace easily broke free and ran out of the circle, where he quickly ignited and screamed in pain as the fire devoured him before falling in a clump on the floor, dead, as his body was blackened and burnt. At that moment, the fire and the damage it caused suddenly disappeared, and the air and temperature returned to normal, except for Father Horace's now smouldering remains, which turned to ash and were blown away by a sudden draught. Father McKinnon burst into tears at the loss of his young friend and colleague, and having crossed himself, he stood still in the circle, saying a short prayer. He said, "We must remain until the light of the new day passes through the windows. We must stay in this circle. Do you understand?" I replied that I was shocked at what had happened and felt guilty for the loss of Father Horace. He assured me that this was nobody's fault except for Sir Gilbert, and we will be rid of him once the light comes. We both sat in silence for the next hour before Father McKinnon, looking saddened and glum at the loss of his friend, decided it was safe to leave. He put on his vestments while I was instructed to act in place for the lost priest, as I carried a large doctor's bag with him to the cellar. As we entered, he screamed, "I know you are hiding here, you vile demon, and I will be soon rid of you for eternity." We entered the room where he recited a prayer of removal and sprinkled the 4 walls, ceiling and floor with holy water, which caused the surfaces to burn like acid thrown onto it. He then opened his black bag and pulled out his copy of the Book of the Dead and recited passages of it in a Coptic dialect, which caused the walls to shimmer as though something was being expelled from within the stonework. A foul, acrid smell once more permeated, and a dark grey misty trail emanated from the walls and ceilings, forming into a grey misty human figure before dissipating into nothingness. With that, the atmosphere changed and the air smelt clean and pure. Closing the book, he said, "There, it is done. He and his followers have been sent back to hell, and the innocents are finally free to move on. But at what cost?" He, fighting back tears, said, "I will have to leave the church after this. They will find it hard accepting any explanation, because in modern-day liturgical thinking of evil, the church has lost its way by not recognizing the presence of it, and perhaps more than ever it still needs to be fought. And in that regard, I will continue this work. The house, he assured me, was cleansed completely, and that transposition of evil wrought by Sir Gilbert de Pomeroy was now destroyed. My family and I never did return to the family home. It was sold as a going concern, and 2 years later it was mysteriously destroyed in a fire. We returned to London, where we resettled in Pimlico, and I, now in my 90th year, conclude the final chapter in this story of my life. I hope that those victims of my ancestor have found peace, and that Father Horace in spirit lies within the protection of our Lord Jesus Christ. The End. The Recalcitrant Pastor, written and read by Christopher Halton. Group Captain Alfred Minns had not imagined that the final phase of the war would find him behind barbed wire, a reluctant guest of the Luftwaffe. Yet after his Lancaster had been pounced upon and struck down during a night raid in late 44, he and several of his crew had parachuted into the dark fields of Württemberg and fallen promptly into German hands. Fluent in the language from his pre-war years in Munich, where he had worked as a sales engineer representing a British industrial giant, Minns could understand not only his captor's words, but also the temper behind them. Following a brief and rather perfunctory questioning in Frankfurt, Minns found himself consigned to Stalag Luft 18. It was a new camp thrown up in some haste, bleak upon a rise and scoured by a wind that seemed to bite through wool and leather alike. 4 compounds lay within the wire, set out with military neatness to the cardinal points, yet they held scarcely a fraction of the men for whom they had been built. The commandant, Oberst Heining, was of the older German school, formal, punctilious, and determined that the usages of war should be observed, however strained the times. Under his hand, a kind of routine established itself, meagre, often uncomfortable, but bearable, and far removed from the tales that filtered through of darker places elsewhere. Thus, within the wire, a fragile but tolerable existence persisted, despite shortages of food and fuel and the late stages of a losing war. All of this was undone when, without warning, prisoners began disappearing. Within a single month, 10 men, British, French, and American, vanished as though the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed them. The guard search teams, known to the prisoners as ferrets, could find neither tunnel nor tampered wire. Vehicles were thoroughly searched, and accommodation huts were stripped plank by plank, but nothing availed. The disappearances continued, and with them the whispering rumours. Some accused other nationalities, others feared a murderous German psychopath lurking among the huts. But there was no proof, no tracks, no bodies, only an oppressive sense that order was slipping away. Heining, as perturbed as the prisoners themselves, summoned the senior Allied officers for an impromptu meeting. Minns suspected the subject was these baffling events, and so he attended alongside Colonel René de la Garde of the Free French Air Force and Colonel Rhys Cummings of the United States Army Air Force. But upon entering the commandant's office, the camp's lone brick structure, a former farmhouse, they encountered an unexpected presence. An SS Standartenführer named Otto Schulze. Schulze was a lean man with pale, wintry eyes, razor-cut blonde hair, and a manner as sharp as a knife blade. He paced slowly behind Heining's desk and appeared to be gathering his thoughts. When he finally addressed them, his tone slapped the air. "The matter of these escapes has reached Berlin. I have been dispatched to resolve this, and by order of Reichsführer Himmler, I now hold command here." He then turned to a rather dismayed Heining and said, "I am relieving you of command. You are ordered to return to Berlin." He faced the assembled officers and added scathingly, "Should another man disappear, I shall order 5 of you shot, and it will be recorded as attempted escapes." Heining could endure no more. He sprang to his feet, his face red with anger. "You have no authority to contravene the Geneva Convention." Schulze, who towered over him, stormed forward to stand nose to nose, a grimacing smile twisting his features. "You are no longer in command. It is clear you and others must have had involvement for this to happen." He barked an order in German, and 2 SS soldiers entered, seizing the now terrified Heining and removing him bodily. He was bundled into a black SS limousine and driven away along a crunchy, icy road through the camp gates before disappearing into the shimmering whiteness of a cold but sunny day. Feeling pleased, Schulze seated himself at the desk and arranged his gloves and hat with an almost delicate precision. Looking directly at the Allied officers, he said rather coolly, "You're under SS protection. Comply with our instructions, and you will not be harmed. Disobey, and you will be shot like the dogs you are." Colonel de la Garde, much smaller in stature and older than the others, retorted, "And you wonder why we French call you Le Boche. I must endure your threats, but one day, whether before man or God, you will answer for your actions. Oberst Heining is a far better man than you will ever be." Schulze lost his temper entirely, screaming at the colonel in poor French. At one point, he pulled his Mauser pistol from its holster and waved it aggressively in the air, while the Allied officers stood in horrified silence, shocked that this man was now their camp commander. "Well," Schulze snapped, "why are you still here?" All 3 men turned and left without a word, aware that Schulze would not hesitate to shoot or punish them under any pretext. Outside, the prisoners watched as the Luftwaffe guards departed in a convoy of trucks that had previously brought the SS troops. Stern-faced guards took positions along the barbed wire and climbed into the 4 watchtowers equipped with machine guns. Others patrolled among the barracks, accompanied by vicious dogs that snapped and snarled. On the parade ground, Minz gathered the Allied leaders. "We have authorized no escapes," he said. "Our arrangements have been consistent for months, so something is occurring beyond our knowledge." De la Garde stamped frost from his boots. "Yet 7 of the missing are your countrymen, mon ami. The Americans have lost 2 and 1 Frenchman is gone. And yet we are only 50 out of your thousands. The balance is peculiar." Cummings, an enormous man in an A2 leather flying jacket and garrison cap, shook his head gravely and pulled up his collar against the biting breeze. "Before the war, I was a homicide detective. This looks planned but unpredictable. If a Luftwaffe guard was at fault, the disappearances may now cease." "Unless the men truly escaped," Minz countered wistfully. "There are no corpses, no blood, no disturbance at all. If only there were more clues." "Then we investigate as detectives," Cummings said. "I want a record of each missing man. Last sighting, hour, companions. Deliver it to me by 2 o'clock tomorrow during free association. Understood?" For several days the camp sank into a bleak quiet. The SS guards prowled like dogs on short chains, watching each prisoner closely with suspicion. During roll calls, searches were frequent, and prisoners were openly threatened. Yet Cummings, despite these difficulties, studied the lists in detail. Eventually he gave up, frowning. Nothing linked the cases save their utter inexplicability. Yet among the chaos and hostility, one man moved almost unseen throughout the camp. Pastor Wilhelm Dax, an elderly Lutheran cleric permitted to administer Christian rites to the prisoners and attend to their spiritual well-being, despite being a German from a neighbouring village. A slight figure, his narrow frame bent with the burden of years, he came and went with a freedom that no one thought to question. The guards nodded him through the gates almost absently, as though he were part of some long-established routine, and the dogs, fierce toward every prisoner, merely drew back and watched him pass. He moved slowly, leaning on a stick, his thin shoulders bowed, his lips working soundlessly. More than one man remarked later that they never heard his step on the wooden floors, nor could they recall the sound of his pony's hooves upon the frozen road. Looking back, Minz could not remember ever seeing the pastor arrive. He was simply there. At the time, such things escaped notice. He would appear in the draughty wooden chapel or beside a sick man's bunk, without anyone recalling having seen him cross the compound. He carried a satchel of warm books from which he read in a soft Latin murmur that few understood, yet which left many oddly comforted or unsettled long after he had gone. He also tended to the foreign labourers employed about the camp, and was granted quiet access to areas within and beyond the wire, a privilege no one seemed inclined to question. On one visit to the camp kitchen compound, Dax paused in the doorway just as Standartenführer Schulze was whipping a young Polish kitchen girl for having dropped a knife. The sight struck the old pastor like a blow. He did not cry out, nor move to intervene, but stood very still, his gloved hand tightening upon the head of his stick. The girl's thin voice rose in desperate pleas, cut short by each stroke. Several prisoners later swore that, at the moment Dax appeared, the air in the kitchen seemed to still, and the whip fell with a strange sluggishness, as though the very space between the two had thickened. Schulze himself hesitated, casting a sharp glance toward the doorway, his arm faltering for the briefest instant, as though some unseen presence had laid a hand upon it. If the pastor noticed, he gave no sign. His lips moved soundlessly, and those nearest thought they heard a faint murmur in a language they did not recognize, and carried on no breath. The moment passed. Schulze's rage returned, and the blows resumed with renewed brutality. The girl crumpled at his feet, her cries fading to a weak moan, and at last falling silent. Dax turned away, leaning heavily on his stick, and departed without a word. As he left, one of the guard dogs chained nearby began to whine and shrink back, its ears flat, staring not at Schulze, but at the pastor's retreating figure. No one remarked upon it at the time. At dawn the next morning, Standartenführer Schulze was nowhere to be found at roll call. As the prisoners stood in ranks in the freezing cold for the twice-daily head count, his deputy, an Obersturmbannführer named Jankel, went to rouse him, but found only Schulze's uniform hung with fastidious neatness, his boots polished, and his room undisturbed. Every door and window was secured from within. No guard had seen him depart. Jankel, already strained by the winter, assumed control. He ordered the camp turned inside out, within and beyond the wire. This took some time, but not a trace of the man remained. A tremor of fear ran through the ranks of the SS, who recalled the 10 missing Allied prisoners. Jankel realized that whoever was responsible could not have been a prisoner, and fear soon spread among the SS troops and their auxiliaries. Not wishing to admit this, Jankel informed the Allied officers that Schulze had been recalled to Berlin, a phrase offered with such stiffness that it convinced no one. Cummings, who had cultivated a trading contact among some SS men, later confided that the guards believed something far stranger had occurred. Despite his hardened Nazi beliefs, Jankel could not shake off his childhood memories from his native Bavaria, where people spoke of beings called die Unterirdischen, the underground ones, who were blamed for people vanishing into hills, caves, or hollow mounds and never seen again. Some said they were fairies or little people with power over the living. He had always dismissed such tales as peasant nightmares, but now he harboured serious doubts, and so for the first time in many years he turned to the church in the form of Pastor Dax, who was ordered at the camp gate to report to the commandant's office. Upon entering, Dax felt a sense of palpable evil. The walls were adorned with Nazi regalia, and a large framed photograph of Hitler stood above the fireplace, with a look of contemptuous malice in his eyes. To Dax, the room felt more like a shrine to Satan, and despite the fire burning brightly, the air seemed cold and stiff. Jankel, on seeing the pastor, had lost his former arrogance, and nervously beckoned him to sit, offering a strained smile. "Pastor," he said humbly, "I was raised as a Catholic, and I turn to you as a man of God. Do you believe these disappearances are the work of some hitherto unknown power? I know in this age such belief seems frivolous, even ridiculous, but what can explain the disappearance of Standartenführer Schulze and these 10 prisoners?" His voice trembled, and sweat gathered on his brow, as he wiped at it with a handkerchief, before taking a large swallow of whiskey. Dax, trying not to smile, replied, "My son, I am but a simple country pastor. I have no knowledge of such things except for the divine power of light and love, which is God." Jankel's voice rose in agitation. He reached across the desk and gripped Dax's hand with sweaty palms. "Pastor, I am a good Christian. I serve the fatherland. I am not a bad man, yet I fear Satan's cloven hoof is afoot in this camp, and he is taking people and their souls to hell." His eyes darted about the room like those of frightened prey. He rose, then sank to his knees beside Dax, pleading, "Pastor, please protect me with prayer. Place me in the safety of our Lord." He began to sob hysterically, gripping the pastor's hands like a child. "My son," said Pastor Dax, "the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh. I will pray for you and your sins, and may the Lord judge you fairly." Dax then left, promising to return to minister to both Jankel and the prisoners. Over the following weeks the prisoners were treated less harshly, though food remained scarce. More timber for fuel was made available. Allied leaders sighed in relief at the absence of further disappearances, and a contact in the fledgling German resistance confirmed that no escapees had reached Allied hands. Neither the Germans nor the prisoners had any explanation for the vanishings, and in a way Schultz's disappearance had saved them from his threatened reprisals. In late December 1944, as German forces were driven steadily back by the Russians in the east and the Western Allies in the west, concern grew among the prisoners that the SS might decide to dispose of them rather than allow their liberation. Whispers circulated of massacres at other camps. The atmosphere, already tense, became brittle with fear. During a service, Pastor Dax assured Minns that despite the advance of the Red Army, they would remain safe and should not worry. When pressed, he could offer no details, merely saying that the Lord worked in mysterious ways. Minns, not a churchgoer himself, nevertheless felt reassured by the pastor's calm demeanour and passed the message to the other leaders, which eased the strained mood. Then, in January 1945, orders arrived for the camp to be evacuated ahead of the Russian advance. A forced march for the prisoners was scheduled for dawn the following day. Jankel informed the pastor that he would be safer evacuating westward at once for fear of Russian reprisals. Pastor Dax assured him that there was no danger to his own safety and visited the camp one last time before the evacuation, carrying his satchel of religious books and texts. The guards, brusque and anxious as they packed to abandon the camp, initially refused him entry. After confirming with Jankel's office, they allowed him to go inside the chapel, accompanied only as far as the door by a guard who waited outside with a cigarette. Dax promised he would not be long. 10 minutes later he emerged, and carrying his satchel, he returned to the gate and departed without further formality in his pony and trap. That evening the guards ordered lights out in the huts. The prisoners retired to their beds unnervingly calm. Even the guard tower lights seemed still, and those who ventured out to reconnoitre reported little, if any, guard activity. It was assumed that some of the guards had already fled in fear of the Russians, with the remainder to follow in the morning. The following day there was no 6:30 a.m. roll call announced over the loudspeaker, yet the prisoners by habit rose and assembled in the bitter cold. Minns and Cummings went to investigate. There were no guards, no sentries, no shouted orders, no figures pacing the watchtowers. The entire SS garrison had vanished as completely as Schulze and the 10 missing prisoners. Minns and Cummings crossed the deserted checkpoints to the commandant's office. Outside stood a familiar pony and trap. Inside, seated quietly at the commandant's desk, was Pastor Dax. He closed a small Latin book as they entered, and inclined his head with a faint smile. "You need not fear further molestation," he said in mild cultured English. "The guards will not return." "You mean they fled?" Cummings asked. "They have been summoned elsewhere," Dax replied. "Their deeds had reached a point beyond forgiveness. I merely ensured that they would trouble God's earth no longer." Minns swallowed. "What do you mean? That is to say, how was it done?" The old pastor rested a hand upon the book. "Through prayer and ancient manuscripts," he said gently, "and with words older than man. That is all." An American officer entered, reporting that the camp was deserted, the stores untouched, and the gates open. The Russians were estimated to be 3 days distant. Cummings, suspecting that Dax knew far more than he had said, asked the question that had haunted him. "Pastor, the 10 prisoners who vanished earlier, was that your doing?" Dax nodded once. "They were not allies. They were German agents planted among you. They too had to be removed." Then with visible effort he rose. "I must now return to where I came. My duty here is done. The Germans will not return." They watched as he mounted the trap and drove away into the pale winter light, his figure diminishing down the icy road until it was lost from sight. 3 days later, the Russians liberated the camp. In the SS barracks, soldiers' uniforms and boots were neatly placed in their lockers, and beds appeared disordered as though they had been slept in. In the mess hall lay plates of half-eaten food, with full and half-empty mugs beside them. The guard posts held abandoned weapons, but as everywhere else, there was no trace of their owners. The Russians were as confounded as the former prisoners. It appeared as though the garrison had simply vanished in an instant, leaving uniform and weapon behind. There was no trace anywhere of Commandant Yankel. The Russians concluded that the SS had fled in civilian clothing, yet personal possessions and garments remained. None of this made sense. Minns and Cummings chose not to share what they knew of Pastor Dax, fearing ridicule, and the prisoners were returned safely to their respective forces and countries. In 1946, Cummings learned that Yankel had been located. The sole Nazi survivor from the camp had been found in Hamburg, clinically insane and unfit to stand trial. He remained in institutions until his death in 1972. But what of Pastor Dax? It was not until 1965, while serving as an attaché at the American Embassy in Berlin, that Cummings received permission from the East German authorities to visit Obergen, Dax's home village, during celebrations marking 20 years of communist rule. Though accompanied by officials, he was allowed to inquire after the pastor, who, if still alive, would have been in his 90s. Cummings did not expect to find him living, but he sought closure and wished to thank the man who, through God's will or some other mercurial process, had saved their lives. The mayor, Herr Gustav Schmidt, escorted him to the small churchyard on the village's edge, where an ancient oak spread its bare branches over weathered stones. He spoke with quiet reverence of Pastor Wilhelm Dax, a man of unyielding moral courage who had denounced Nazi cruelty from his pulpit. For this he had been seized by the Gestapo and shot in 1943. They walked on in silence until Schmidt halted before a solitary grave beneath the oak. The stone was simple, the lettering neat. Wilhelm Dax, Pastor, 1871 to 1943, sei getreu bis in den Tod. Cummings stared at the dates for several minutes, his breath misting in the cold air. "He died a year before we met him," he said at last, his voice unsteady. "This is impossible." Schmidt nodded solemnly. "I was here," he replied. "The whole village was. We buried him ourselves." He paused, then added in a lower voice, almost to himself, "The earth was very heavy that day." Cummings looked sharply at him, but the mayor merely folded his hands behind his back and gazed toward the church tower, offering nothing further. No explanation presented itself. The fact stood stark and immovable, yet Cummings knew that during that bitter winter, when cruelty had seemed ascendant and hope all but extinguished, something had intervened, something beyond flesh or earthly authority, answering only to God. He never spoke of Pastor Dax again. The end.